Hello, good evening, and welcome to this Centre for Policy Studies on the US election. We're 2 weeks out. It's okay though, because we don't need to pay attention to anything else for the next 2 weeks, because we're going to find out all the answers to everything now, what we need to look for on the night, where we need to be looking, and maybe what the outcome is going to be. I'm Emily Duncan. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at the Centre for Policy Studies. I'm delighted to be joined by a fantastic panel. First off, we will hear from Matthew Shaddick, who is the Head of Political Betting at Ladbrokes. After that, we will go to the US, where we will hear from Larry Grossman, who is Managing Director of the CT Group in Washington. And finally, rounding us out, getting us into the details, will be Sam Lyon, who is the Managing Director of CT Partners in London. Please do get involved and ask questions. You can do that through the Zoom chat or in the comment function on Facebook. We will get through as many of your questions as we possibly can. But first, when we are ready with the slides, we will hand over to Matthew to start us off.
Thanks, Emily, and thank you to the CPS for inviting me along. As Emily says, I'm going to give you a very short rundown on what the betting markets have been saying and are currently saying about this election and how it relates to the polls. So Sam, if you could show us the first slide. So if the question is, what are the chances of Trump being re-elected? That very much depends on who you ask. The lines in blue here are the estimates, the probability estimates of some leading forecasting models, essentially based on polls. You can see The Economist there, 9% chance of Trump winning, 538, Nate Silver's cites 12%, DDHQ is another good one. They're quite optimistic, relatively, 14% chance of Trump winning. There are several others of these like this, YouGov, New Statesman, they're all roughly the same. They're all saying Trump's chances of being re-elected are somewhere around 10, 15% at the best. But if you look at the red lines, the bookmakers, they're in a completely different world. So Labrax right now, our prices suggest that Trump's got around a 39% chance of winning. Those other two lines there, roughly the same. Betfair, which is the leading peer-to-peer betting exchange in Europe, about a 40% chance. And Predictit, which is the only place that Americans can legally gamble on this election. It's a platform that some people use over there, but they're pretty much in line with Europe, saying there's around a 39% chance of Trump being re-elected. A huge yawning chasm between those two methods of guessing. We'll talk about that perhaps a bit later, about why it's so different. I mean, if you had a model which told you what the chances of a Premier League football match being a particular result were, let's say your model gave Manchester United a 25% bigger chance of winning a football match in the betting markets, well, you can throw your model in the bin. It's useless. There's no way you can be that far out from the betting markets. Whether these models can be accurate, being this far out, some people are skeptical. I personally, despite being a bookie, am more on the side of the models than the odds at the moment. So perhaps we can move on to the next slide, Sam. Is this normal, this kind of gap between the betting markets and the models? Well, no, it isn't, because if you look at 2016, those two lines there are how 538 in yellow saw the probability of Trump winning throughout the campaign. And the red line is how Labrax saw it based on our implied odds, the chance implied by our odds. Pretty much the same. It's just like the betting markets were tracking their models in 2016, apart from one small gap in August. On the right-hand side, you can see 2020, they're totally divergent. And in fact, they're now moving in the opposite direction. The betting markets over the last few days have become more confident of Trump winning. Whereas as time runs out and the polls don't seem to change, the models like 538 in yellow are moving the other way. Just next slide, please, Sam. And there's just a couple of lines comparing the odds in 2016 in blue of Trump winning, the odds in 2020 of Trump winning, or at least the chances in winning implied by the odds. So all the way through 2020, the betting markets have been giving Trump a higher chance of being re-elected than he was being elected in the first place in 2016. And that's despite the fact that he's seemingly in a much worse position in the polls than he was 4 years ago. Next slide, please, Sam. And here's somewhat explaining why the odds are where they are. The red, this is the amount of money that Labrax have been taking every week over the last couple of months. The red lines being how much proportionally we're taking on Trump compared to Biden. You can see in some of these weeks in August, we were taking 80 or 90% of the money was going on Trump. It's been a bit closer in recent weeks. The only week that we took more money on Biden was the week commencing the 28th of September. That was the week of the first presidential debate, and Trump's hospitalization. That's what needs to happen. The betting markets swing in Biden's favor. And just to give you an idea of how much money has been staked here, I mean, this is a huge market in betting terms. My guess would be there'll be at least £1 billion wagered on this around the world, various betting platforms. I mean, that's small beer compared to bond markets and foreign exchange markets, I realise. But in terms of betting, this is going to be not only the biggest political betting market of all time, we think it's going to be twice as big as 2016. This is like to be the biggest single betting market that's ever happened, bigger than any sporting event, bigger than any soccer match or horse race. This is going to be a big deal for the betting industry. So we just have the next slide, please, Sam. Just a quick demonstration of the latest odds at Labrax. At any rate, you can bet on all sorts of different things. These are just some of the markets available. If you don't want to bet on who's going to win outright, you can bet on the electoral college totals. 66 to 1, there's a tie, there is a plausible combination of states which could lead us to a tie, although I think Trump would probably remain president if that happened. And a list of specials you can see on the right-hand side there, including Trump to lose the popular vote but be re-elected, which is essentially what happened back in 2016. He got 2 million fewer votes than Clinton, but still won. That's the 7 to 4 chance. And a myriad of other possibilities if you want to risk your money on this election. But I think that's enough for me from the time being, and I'll hand you back to Emily.
Thank you, Matthew. I mean, this is in many ways summing up what I was saying just before we went live, actually, which is that I've had conversations with 2 different very well-informed people this week, one of whom told me that it's absolutely Trump is going to win. There's no way he loses this election. Somebody else who's told me that Biden is definitely going to be our next president. But I would now like to hand over to Larry, who can perhaps tell us a little bit more about what it's like in Washington and what he's seeing and hearing on the ground in the US. So over to you, Larry.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you, Matthew, for the introduction there to what we're going to look at through some research we conducted over a very similar period to where you actually saw money going to a Joe Biden victory. So we surveyed people in what we considered 7 interesting states, several of which were the traditional toss-up states that people have focused in on for the past 6 months: Florida, Michigan, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. And then 3 others that we thought were representative of some of the dynamics that were going to make this, again, a very close race, and maybe even have some surprises with Georgia, Ohio, and Texas. Let's go on to the next one, Sam, because I think it's worth jumping in right here. The people we were most interested in, we broke into two obvious categories: Trump voters and Biden voters. We then took a look at swing voters, people who were undecided about who to vote for or likely to change their minds before the election day, or Trump defectors, those who voted for Trump in 2016 but are currently intending to vote for somebody else. And, you know, of that group, we're going to talk a little bit and give you some insight into what motivates a swing voter and what motivated Trump defectors. Let's start with what Matthew was talking about, which is what's required to win. And as I'm sure everybody knows by now, we in America don't directly elect our presidents. We, in fact, elect electors who represent us as voters. And we have, it requires 270 of those members of the so-called electoral college to vote for a single candidate in order for them to win. Very quickly, we break our country up into 3 different parts. You have safe Republican states, safe Democratic states, and then those states that are tougher to call, where campaigns focus in on generally and then get more narrow and narrow casted, to the point right now where we have 5 or 6 states which are in play, and all of the candidates' attention, all of their time, all of their money is focused there. The president, for example, today was in Arizona yesterday, which is one of the 6 battleground states that remains, and he's in Pennsylvania today. President Obama is speaking in Philadelphia at a rally on behalf of Vice President Biden on Thursday. So all of this attention is now coming down to 5 or 6 critical states. And we can, during questions, I'm happy to take any questions about some of the dynamics in the states, because each one is a little bit different. And obviously Florida is the big prize of them all, being the largest of the remaining battleground states that somebody has to win to be president. Next, Sam, if you would. For me, this is ground zero for the next 2 weeks, which is how likely are voters to turn out. And what we're seeing here is an extraordinarily motivated electorate. People have their opinions and they express them with great certainty and great clarity. And you'll see here amongst the Biden voters in blue, the Trump voters in red, people at very high numbers. We haven't seen numbers this high in terms of voter motivation, voter enthusiasm since 2004, which was at the height of the disastrous time of the Iraq War, John Kerry versus George Bush, where we saw such opinions, such clarity, and such motivation. We then saw this dip tremendously. These numbers would have been the 40s to 50s in 2016. So we're seeing a nearly 50% increase in the question on how likely will people vote in the affirmative just over a 4-year period. And if we could go back to that for one more second, what I think that that translates into is we've seen, over the course of the past several months, some indicators that this will go to very high voter turnout, not just high motivation. We had very high turnout in the 2018 midterm elections, which were fairly considered, they always are, a referendum on the president. And so that was the highest voter turnout we had in the midterms since 1914. Even though it was less than 50% of the population, it was 4 or 5% higher than it had ever been since the pre-World War I era. And then secondly, I'll give you an example, which I think is very insightful for seeing how voters are acting, was in the middle of July, during the middle of the hot summer in the pandemic, in a uncontested primary. We'd already picked Joe Biden as the Democratic candidate, and we'd already selected Donald Trump as the Republican candidate. In historic numbers, people in Louisiana came out to vote in their primary in the middle of July. So we're actually seeing voters act, whether it's during the primary season or now in early voting and mail-in voting. Sam, sorry to interrupt you there, but let's keep going then. Issues are driving people, and there are 2 sets of issues which have really become very clear over the past few months. The first has to do with the pandemic, and the second has to do with the economy. We can include healthcare, which has come into focus with the pandemic and so-called Obamacare, our national health system, and then the economy and jobs. And what this breaks down to is you can see that Biden supporters are uniquely worried about the pandemic and the healthcare that they're going to receive or their insurance policies. Republicans tend to focus on the economy and jobs. And it's been that way for the last couple of months. And it was interesting to hear Matthew say that the president's sickness back now 2 weeks ago was a driver in people's, at least in people's betting habits, because it brought back into light the pandemic and our healthcare system. Go next, please. What we also see is both campaigns have focused very strongly into their own messages, and they're being well received by voters, though the voters have already broken into their camps. For the Trump campaign messages, the coronavirus is, because I think it's just the compelling message of this election season, probably is around the world, for both Trump campaign messages and Biden campaign messages. Then we see a split. The second highest polling here is the Supreme Court nomination, with the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett. For President Trump, this is an obvious place to focus in on, because it satisfies the needs of a couple of core constituencies, and it allows him to talk about the promise he made in 2016 about turning the courts back into conservative majorities. And it's one place that he can take great and should be taking great credit for. And we see that peaking with the new Supreme Court nominee. And then the economy. The president has always outpolled Joe Biden on his ability to handle the economy, and that is clearly a key message for the Trump campaign. For the Biden campaign, other than coronavirus and healthcare, which we've talked about, this summer's the death of George Floyd and the ensuing protests we had around America, both in big cities like here in Washington and New York and the West Coast, but also around the country more generally, has translated into a very strong enthusiasm levels amongst Democratic voters. We'll go next. This is one of the more, I thought, when we got the research in, one of the most revealing slides we have for you today, because it shows to me two things. One is Trump's worried, has focused very much on his campaign slogan. It's resonated with people, first in 2016, Make America Great Again, which he's continued with, and then Keeping America Great. As you can see from the Biden campaign slogan, nothing seems to resonate with people. One could come to the conclusion that the Biden people should be really worried that they don't have a slogan with great traction, a la Making America Great Again. I think they're not worrying about this. Having talked with Biden campaign people, having watched this play out over the last couple of months, I think that their message is quite simple. He's not Donald Trump. And around my neighborhood, for example, we see lots of yard signs that play on the word Biden, which is by Don. And it's as simple as that. And we've joked around, my household, that you could simply have Trump Biden signs that says, Joe Biden, I'm not Donald Trump. So I think a lot of that's reflected here, but it's interesting to see how the Biden campaign slogans just don't resonate with people, like Make America Great Again or Keep America Great. And then based on that, what we also see is just how polarizing the president is and how uninspiring Joe Biden is. And if you look at the question, I don't think Joe Biden is a great candidate, but I'll do anything to get rid of Donald Trump. You can see in the numbers on the agreeing with that statement how big it is. And if you're a Trump supporter, or you're a Trump defector, how important that was. And so I think behind this is the president has his strong supporters. They will come out, they're active, they're motivated, they will come out and vote. And Joe Biden has strong support against Donald Trump. And the thing we all have to watch for on November 3rd is that transition from a referendum against the president to a vote for Joe Biden. And that's going to make the difference on election day, is that transition from just being against something to being for something.
Larry, thanks very much for that. And I'll pick up from here with a slide that actually feeds back into what Emily said at the start of it's either absolutely done and dusted, it's Biden's, or no, completely not. There's no chance that Trump is going to lose. So in terms of win expectation, who do voters in those 7 swing states think is going to win? Well, it's on a knife edge. It's incredibly kind of divided. And I think that probably reflects where we all are at the moment. That's among all voters. But where both the campaigns will be at the moment is, how do we pick off those swing voters, those undecided voters, those people who might change their mind or are not absolutely convinced they're going to go out and vote? How do we get those in our camp? So while this looks very evenly divided, when you then look at win expectation just among swing voters, 38% think the Republicans or President Trump will win, 46% think that Biden will win. And when you go to Trump defectors, just 14% believe that Trump will win and 70% think that Biden will win. If you're the Biden campaign, those numbers would be incredibly worrying. Hence why the campaign manager has been out recently and over the weekend saying this result is on an absolute knife edge, because they're guarding against complacency that voters do come out and actually vote. I think the high turnout figures that we saw earlier on the earlier slide is a recognition that people realize their vote matters. And that is a stark change from 2016, where there was such a high expectation that Hillary would win. So look, with 2 weeks to go, can either campaign do it? Well, if you look at the figures as to whether people will change and voters might change their mind, then you would certainly say yes. There's two columns that I would focus on here, because those are the ones that I'm going to focus on in terms of the voter groups as we go through these slides. And that's the first one, which is the swing group. Well, by sheer definition, they're 100% likely or possible that they'll change their mind. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in the swing category. But also the Trump defectors, that 4 out of 10 essentially Trump defectors might still change their minds towards it. But if you look across some of those swing states as well, in that light gray color, between 17 and 28% of people could still change their mind. So there is still quite a bit to be played for. So let's have a quick look to start off with in terms of who are the Trump defectors. Of the 100% of people who voted for Trump in 2016, he is currently losing around, in these 7 swing states, 11% to Biden. Those are the Trump defectors. And he is picking up around 5% from people who voted for Clinton before, but aren't going to vote for Biden and are actually going to vote for Trump. So these are the Trump defectors. So there's a net loss to a certain extent there at the moment of -6. So what do those Trump defectors look like? Let's start in the left-hand column. They tend to be more male, they tend to be older, they tend to be white, they tend to have children, but do not have a university degree. You would argue that they look like Trump voters. Well, they are, because they were in 2016 by sheer definition. But then if you look on the right-hand side as to what's driving their vote at the moment, and you start to see why they are defectors. They believe that Biden is best able to handle coronavirus and the economy, and they think Biden would make the best president. And the types of issues that will determine their vote are coronavirus and healthcare over and above economy and jobs. So just bear that in mind when we start looking through some of the other slides. So who are the other ones? The swing votes. So of the people who neither voted for Trump nor Hillary Clinton in 2016, around 25% who voted, didn't even vote, or were voting for an independent. As you can see from the transition from the top bar to the second bar, that Biden is picking up most of those at the moment. However, I would still look at that 13% in terms of don't know yet as to where they're going to go. So what do the swing voters look like? Well, they look a little bit more like Biden voters. They are slightly younger. They're more ethnically diverse. Majority are employed and have a university education. Although on that last one as well, they're getting their news from Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And we certainly know the dominance that Trump has with regards to Twitter. So you kind of think, well, hang on, why are these swing voters? Well, if you look at the right-hand side, while they may look at issues that are much more aligned to, say, the Biden campaign, only 44% of them think Biden would make the best president. Now, that's a figure that you'd be concerned about in regards to Biden, as to whether you can keep them and get them motivated to come out and vote for you come election day. So as Larry said, there are two main issues. And I'm going to go through issues, then I'm going to go through a few candidate attributes, and then finally some regression analysis as to actually what are the close associations on vote, and therefore as we go through the final 2 weeks, what should you be looking for as to what the which way the result will go. First of all, and we're going to really focus on the yellow bars, which are the swing voters, and the black bar, which are the Trump defectors. So in terms of current economic performance, there is a net 11% of swing voters. That means 11% more believe the economy is doing well than doing poorly. Now, that obviously feeds more into the Trump campaign agenda than it does on the Biden one. But as you see in terms of the Trump defectors, net minus 36. So 36% more Trump defectors believe the economy is performing badly or poorly than well. So what's the other issue? Well, the other issue is in terms of Trump's handling of the economy. So when asked whether Donald Trump's handling of the coronavirus pandemic has made me reconsider my support for him, a net positive 16% of swing voters, that's 16% more, saying it has made them reconsider their support for him than haven't. And again, the net positive for Trump defectors as well. But I would still point out in that middle bar in terms of total disagree, there is still 28% of swing voters who are disagreeing with that statement with regards to how he has handled the coronavirus. So let's look at some attributes and associations with Trump. And any election is a choice. And therefore, it really is about net equity rather than just where someone stands individually on an issue or an attribute. It's how they compare to their competitor. So the numbers to focus on are the numbers in brackets next to each descriptor. Now, you'd kind of expect some of the top ones. I'm not going to kind of focus on those really. What is most surprising at the moment and would be a bit of a concern with regards to the Trump campaign is where you'd expect him to have a healthy lead in terms of protecting and creating jobs, tackling crime, best for national security and the economy. Those are very slender leads and almost within the kind of margin of error. And therefore, I think the Biden campaign has done well in neutralizing some of those strengths that you would normally associate with President Trump. So what are the ones that are associated with Biden? Well, the big one there, and you can see why he's focusing so much with regards to coronavirus, is right in the middle, a best to tackle the coronavirus pandemic, a net 12%, i.e. 12% more people associate that with Biden than they do with President Trump. Hence why he wants to keep the debate very much about coronavirus, about health, and best to handle that. And as you'll see lower down, there are even some economic descriptors in which he's managed to get a very slim lead or certainly neutralize within the margin of error. The box at the top, though, in terms of too progressive and too old, while the net figure is related to Biden, it's the gray figures in the middle of people saying it's like neither or it's like both or I don't know. You'd have expected those attacks from President Trump with regards to President Biden, the Vice President Biden, would have landed a bit more and had a bit more kind of cut through. And I think certainly as we look through the coming weeks, the Trump campaign, if they're looking at similar figures, would be wanting to make a much more of a dent in those attributes. So finally, I'm just going to move on to what we call 3 regression slides. So regression tells us what issues, attributes, or messages are most associated with each candidate. And the higher up the y-axis, the more from 0, the more influential it is in terms of positive vote association. And the further down you go from 0, the more influential it is in terms of a negative vote association. The further to the right it is, the more it's like Donald Trump. The further to the left it is, it's more like Joe Biden. The standout thing from this is that while Vice President Biden, I think by certainly some consensus, would seem to be in a stronger position, the big associations with vote are actually much more focused with regards to Trump and almost kind of within his control. He is by far and away much more strongly associated with a vote for himself than Biden is for a vote for Biden. And I'd focus on 2 things here. Firstly, the relative position between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, but also the net position between Donald Trump on the right-hand side and down on the left-hand side, fairly near kind of where the axes cross. I don't think Joe Biden is a great candidate, but I'll do anything to get rid of Donald Trump. That association is way stronger with regards to Donald Trump, and therefore, while their campaign may appear to be in a weaker position, actually the issues that are likely to drive vote are more within kind of Donald Trump's control. If you look at some of the other ones on the right-hand side, Donald Trump may be controversial, but he's what the majority of us are thinking. And also, I don't like Donald Trump, but I agree with the choices he's making. If he can drive those up and to the right, so they become more influential and more associated with him, then I think we'll start seeing some of the kind of shift back towards Donald Trump in the last couple of weeks. Conversely, some of the issues that, and Larry touched on this earlier, some of the issues or attributes that the Biden camp have to play with is very much the kind of not Donald Trump rather than the kind of pro Joe Biden aspects. The other thing I would point out about this is what's driving vote against Joe Biden. And those are in the bottom left-hand corner. And there's two things on that. One is I'm worried about the liberal woke agenda that the Democrats are advocating. And the other one is that I'm worried that if Joe Biden dies in office, Kamala Harris will become president. The reason I highlight those is because just after I go through the next two slides, which are just picking two of the swing states and showing the difference between them, because obviously it is an electoral college system, I'm just going to conclude by suggesting what you look out for as key indicators of which way the vote is going to go. So that's among soft voters. So among those soft voters, those swing voters, those Trump defectors, the people who haven't made up their mind yet or likely to change their mind, you can see that actually the big issues that could change vote, could influence vote, are more in Donald Trump's hands than they are necessarily in Joe Biden's hands. I'm going to pick out the same regression analysis or the same statistical analysis, but just looking at Texas and just looking at Pennsylvania. And what you see with Texas, and this isn't among soft voters, this is among all voters in Texas. Again, that strong advantage that Donald Trump has over Joe Biden in terms of vote association, but also some of those personal attributes that I don't like him, but I agree with the choices he's making. And on the negative side for Biden, the concern about the liberal woke agenda. So when we look at this from a campaign point of view, some of those influences and vote associations looks that Texas could be more within the hands of Donald Trump campaign than the Joe Biden campaign. If you contrast that, say, with Pennsylvania, and you see actually it's neutralized a lot more, and I would probably highlight where Donald Trump is compared with on the left-hand side, I don't think Joe Biden is a great candidate, but I'll do anything to get rid of Donald Trump. The relative influence on those is much more even than it was, say, in the Texas one or in the soft votes. So with 2 weeks to go, what are you going to be looking for then? If no one really knows or win expectation is finally kind of balanced, what should you be looking for as to which way it's going to swing? From a Trump perspective, if he and his campaign can drag the public debate much more back onto economy and jobs and attack Biden and raise the expectation, or not the expectation, but recognize that a Biden presidency is very real, and raise the consequence for that with regards to a woke agenda or a weak Biden being led by the Democrats or by Harris. Those are the things that I would watch for as to what might start swinging it back towards Trump. And if you're Biden, or you're looking at what to watch for as to whether Biden is holding his lead or is remaining in the ascendancy, it's the public debate remaining on coronavirus and health issues, highlighting that Trump's is embarrassing, is divisive, and the attacks on that. And exactly as the campaign is doing at the moment, is avoid complacency by continuing to say that the result is on a knife edge and every single vote matters to ensure that you do get those Trump defectors and those swing voters out for you. and so that we wouldn't see so they don't see a repeat of the 2016. Those are the things that we would be looking at as to see which way it's going over the next couple of weeks. And on that, Emily, I was going to hand back to you.
Lovely, thank you. So I can already see a number of questions coming in, so please do keep continuing to get involved in the conversation. Very briefly for the panelists, the debate, the final debate, does it change anything?
Larry, we were discussing this earlier. Do you want to kick off?
Yeah, Emily, thanks. It's a great question, because I think it fits. Obviously, we have a debate on Thursday night, the last of the scheduled 3, but we'll only have 2 presidential debates. And I put it in the context of October surprises. Even though the first debate was the end of September, we'll categorize these things together and what can actually move people. As we saw with what Matthew presented, the debate and obviously President Trump's illness were both market movers here. This debate, I think, has the likelihood of having the same effect, which we saw in the first one. The first debate impacted 2 very important constituencies. One is it impacted suburban women who within days were reflecting their move away from President Trump. And it was reflected in seniors who we saw a real decline among senior support in with President Trump. And that actually was quite profound in Florida, a state which is a must-win for either candidate, and also a state that President Trump carried with a large number of senior citizens. So I think this final debate, more importantly than, let's say, some new story on the president's taxes or another attack on the vice president's son, whatever those happen to be, the debate has the potential to be a very compelling event for the last final 10 or 12 days of this election.
I think I would probably just add to that, what will be very influential is does it set a new kind of media agenda or public debate agenda with regards to the economy, with regards to jobs. And I think certainly if you're the Trump campaign, that's what you need to get it onto and away from the coronavirus and on their health issues. I think that's the first thing that I'd be kind of looking for, is over the week after that debate, is a lot of the coverage, is a lot of the conversation, is a lot of the debate much more focused with regards to economy than it is, say, coronavirus.
And if we can just get into a little bit of a key point, I suppose, which I'm interested in from both the polling angle and also from the betting angle. When you've got turnout being predicted to be so possibly unprecedentedly high, how does that affect how you go about compiling the odds from Matthew's point of view, but also how you go about conducting your polls and extrapolating information? Does it change how you need to approach things? Do you think turnout will be as high as is being predicted? How do you build in those margins for error?
From my point of view, I think it just adds a bit of extra uncertainty to the race, because America's traditionally a low turnout election anyway. If it goes up by 5% or something, that could make a substantial difference. I think it's quite hard to be confident who it's going to be in favour of, because we've seen elections quite frequently down the years, not just in the US, where people have said, well, if turnout's high, that'll be good for side X or party Y. And quite frequently it turns out to be the other way around. So I'm not going to draw any big conclusions from early voting numbers or overall turnout numbers, but I do think it makes it slightly harder to predict. And I guess that's good for Trump, given that at the moment the odds are against him.
I think from a polling perspective, when you're looking through the polling, it is in the end about human behavior, and therefore you need to look at it through a kind of human's eyes. And there was obviously a ton of data behind this, and we couldn't show all the data. But one of the key slides that Larry and I picked up on when we got the data back was the motivation for voting. And it's very clear, and this backs up a lot of the other data as well, that Trump supporters are overwhelmingly a vote for Donald Trump. whereas the vote for Biden is a very kind of strong vote against Donald Trump. And where the kind of turnout, for me, there's two things that kind of matter that I kind of think about with regards to those turnout projections. One is, are you more motivated to go and vote for something, or are you more motivated to go and vote against something? And the second thing is, how much have voters taken note of the 2016 result, and that win expectation versus my kind of vote really matters. As a parallel to a certain extent, what we certainly saw during the 2017 election in the UK was there wasn't a high expectation that Jeremy Corbyn could become Prime Minister. And therefore there was quite a lot of kind of voter complacency. And therefore you got a result that was far closer than people were kind of predicting, because there was such a expectation that there was going to be a large majority for the Conservatives in 2017. So I think on that turnout, it's weighing up those two things. If you're voting for something, are you more motivated than those who are voting against something? And how does it compare in terms of 2016 in terms of that voter complacency? And I'd certainly expect the Biden camp, an overarching message from them for the last 2 weeks is this result is on a knife edge. Do not leave it to chance.
And it's looking as if it actually is on a knife edge as well, from everything we're seeing.
I mean, I totally agree. I mean, I think the fact that expectations are actually quite a long way, including the betting market expectations, are quite a long way from what the polls actually suggest, is likely good for Biden, because if everyone did assume that, oh, he's 10 points clear, there's 2 weeks to go, he's cruising, he's got a 90% chance of victory, that could have dampened turnout on the Democrat side as they became complacent and assumed he was going to win. So the more people can talk up the idea that it's close, even though the polls don't suggest it is going to be very close, the better that is for Biden.
Just to get some of the questions from the audience, and one from Michael Adam, who, I mean, he asks, to what extent might fear of a Democrat clean sweep of White House and Congress prompt some voters to reluctantly back Trump? But more broadly, what, this is for me, what do we think the chances are of, you know, Trump keeping the White House but losing the Senate and things like that? Are those things that you've been exploring, Matthew, with your...
Yeah, I mean, I can give you the figure. I mean, the chance of a Democrat clean sweep are somewhere around 55 to 60% according to the odds, so quite high. And actually, I kind of see it the other way around from the questioner. You can see some Republican incumbent senators now arguing that, well, look, Trump's going to lose. We need to make sure we keep the Senate to stop the Democrats doing what they want. I don't know how compelling that's going to be, but that is an argument that some are making on the right.
Larry, is it worth adding your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because it goes then to what motivates voters. And I think the fact that this is a presidential election makes it different than if it were a midterm election, where somebody's motivation would be to, in this case, I think in this year, where people are motivated for the top of the ticket. It's very clear. You're either for Donald Trump or you're against Donald Trump. And that's how you're voting. The down ballot issues are important in I think on a state by state level. What we haven't seen is a flow of money away from, what we've seen is a huge increase of money to Joe Biden in early July, mid-July, right around toward the conventions. For the first time, he outpaced and is now dramatically outpacing President Trump in contributions. And that shows a degree of motivation and enthusiasm by his voters. And they're largely coming from small donors, the people who may have voted for Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren before. But we haven't seen money move away from the president to Republican Senate candidates. So the president's voters haven't either thrown him overboard or turned their attention with thought in mind towards quote unquote saving the Senate. It just hasn't happened. In fact, the Democrats down ballot in the Senate have completely out fundraised the Republicans in the past few months. by huge amounts. So then we look at the key Senate races in Arizona, where we could look at it and say, so goes Trump, so goes Martha McSally, the incumbent, against Mark Kelly. And then we look at Colorado, Maine, and Iowa, and a couple of others. I think it's going to depend largely, it'll track with the presidential. And then we've got some interesting states like North Carolina and South Carolina, Georgia, which people are paying very close attention to, because these are states which Democrats have usually underperformed against Republicans, but is all within the margin of error. So I think voters aren't making that decision this time around, largely because you're pro-Trump or anti-Trump, and that's been the setup for now close to maybe 4 years.
That's interesting, because there are some big names in some Senate seats where attention focused on Lindsey Graham obviously being one of them, but you think it's going to depend on what happens at the top of the ticket more so than in previous elections?
Yes, and I think Lindsey Graham is an interesting example, because he's a somebody who we've all paid attention to for many of us for a long time, for obviously in the news lately with the confirmation hearings on Amy Coney Barrett. But South Carolina is a place which the Republicans have controlled for a very long time and are likely to do so in this election. There's an old adage that a close race in a state like South Carolina means the Republicans win 52-48. And so while Jamie Harrison, who's an excellent candidate, has raised an unprecedented amount of money, just an extraordinary amount of money for a Senate race in South Carolina for a Democrat, it's just the odds, how the mechanics of the vote are going to work, and it'll be a very tough race for him. Look, we'll see what happens on election night, but that's good. That's a tough one for Democrats. Where we're more likely to see Democratic pickups, besides places like Colorado, which is a blue state, Arizona, which is a swing state. We're seeing in Maine and Iowa, with two very strong candidates for the Democrats against incumbents for the Republicans. In both cases are women who are suffering from their alignment with President Trump amongst female voters.
Sorry, Matthew, go ahead.
I was just going to say there's about a 30% chance Lindsey Graham loses, according to the latest odds.
Yeah.
Colin asks, ignoring personalities, how often has a Republican president not got a second term? Now, by my memory, it's George H.W. Bush and Ford in recent times. Is there anybody I'm forgetting? No.
That's
no.
it.
There you go, Colin. That's a decisive answer. You often don't get one of those in one of these.
No, but the key behind that, to broaden it for a second, is interesting, because it's where we've had one-term presidents with Jimmy Carter. Put President Ford aside. It's an anomaly for this discussion. But in the case of the two more interesting ones, which impacts President Trump, is that Jimmy Carter and George H.W. Bush lost when the economy was in a real downturn, when jobs figures were awful and everything. And certainly that's the situation here, which the economy translates into a whole discussion on the coronavirus and the president's handling of the pandemic.
So Jan Halper is asking, what is the likelihood of potential Biden voters not feeling motivated to go out to vote if they believe the current polls that seem to indicate Biden will win? And as a kind of a further point to that, it struck me when you were describing the swing voters that look like Biden voters, because what they really looked like to me was Bernie bros. And we haven't really got into, do the Bernie supporters come out for Biden, because he is very different to Bernie. And that was something that Clinton was said to suffer with in 2016. What do you think, Sam, from your research?
I think there's two things that I would say about that. And we've kind of briefly discussed before that, yes, the motivation in terms of preventing voter complacency from the Biden side is very kind of tangible, and hence why you've seen the campaign manager come out so strongly with regards to this on a knife edge. You've got to get out and vote. With regards in terms of some of the swing voters looking kind of more Bernie-esque, as it were, both campaigns can use that. One is that Biden can use it as why, if that's what's driving your vote, why would you not come out and get President Trump out of office? That's how that campaign would be using it and looking to drive it. But equally on the President Trump side of things, you'd be using it to demonstrate that actually a President Biden or a Biden presidency would be one that is controlled actually by the Democrats in a much more kind of Bernie agenda. And to see who's kind of winning in terms of that framing, I'd be looking out for increasing attacks in terms of a woke agenda and maybe a kind of puppet Biden presidency versus the kind of Biden campaign one, which would be Trump will destroy the environment, Trump can't be trusted on health and those types of issues. On any campaign, it essentially in the end, it's about the campaign that best frames and gets their messages to cut through. So on any issue, both have got opportunities on that. I think at a higher level, you'd certainly, from President Trump's campaign, you'd want to keep it on economy and jobs, and from Biden's, you'd want to keep it on coronavirus and health. But on issues like that, in terms of Bernie Sanders supporters and those, both can use it. And actually, we were discussing earlier, if you were on the President Trump campaign, you do have to make a President Biden or a Biden presidency very real, because you've got to demonstrate the consequence for that. And at this late stage in any campaign, you can't introduce new things. It is about exacerbating and it's about amplifying latent concerns that there already are. And as you saw from the regression analysis, one of the latent concerns that actually stops voters coming out for Biden is that they're worried about the liberal woke agenda. So I would be certainly watching for how much that gains traction over the next couple of weeks, because it will depress the Biden vote very much in terms of, are they going to come out to vote for him? And if you're not seeing that as much, then it may be that Biden campaign is managing to neutralize that and is not being kind of goaded into kind of respond to it.
You have perfectly answered Aidan's question, which I was just about to come to as well. So I will flip it and say, does the culture war, does the woke agenda, does any of this damage Trump at all? Or does this just bolster his vote?
Again, it goes down to that point, who uses it best, of who can control the debate and control the narrative the most and frame that choice in voters' minds. I would say for some of those swing voters, some of those swath voters who have yet to make up their mind, if they start seeing that a Biden presidency is very real and could come with significant consequences, then that will start depressing some of the Biden stuff, and you might see more people coming out to vote for President Trump. But on the other hand, if you see that Biden is controlling it more with a kind of Trump divisiveness message, that we need to move on and get rid of Trump, then it'll start shifting towards him. It's about who's controlling and framing that debate.
So a question from an anonymous attendee here. The issue for independent voters now is who is the least worst candidate. Many of these voters do not like Trump, but cannot vote for Biden. Do you agree?
I don't really. I mean, I don't know where the information is that these people can't vote for Biden. Literally the entire reason the Democrats ended up with Biden as the candidate was because he was the most unobjectionable person you could possibly imagine. He's been a middle of the road senator for 40 years, or whatever it is. He was a totally moderate vice president and a totally moderate administration for 8 years. That's why he's the candidate, and it isn't Bernie and it isn't Elizabeth Warren or anyone else. So I would, the attacks that the Republicans try to make on Biden, that he's going to be controlled by the radical left and so on. I mean, I don't think that's going to cut through at all, because it's Joe Biden. It's not Bernie Sanders. It's Joe Biden. So he's you could see in the first debate he was trying to put some distance between himself and anything that could be considered far left, and I don't think that tactic is going to work for Trump.
Larry, do you agree?
Yeah, I'd agree, and I was going to answer the same way with regard by looking at the primaries as well. Democrats certainly made a choice by picking Joe Biden, even when the odds were against him. It wasn't a happenstance that he was the last man standing. He was the last man standing with the most delegates going by a clear amount going into the convention. And I think it was, again, as Matthew said, it was interesting. It was interesting to hear him during the primaries distance himself from the left of the party. And it was interesting in the debate, again, for him to distance himself from the left of the party. People are dying for him to say he'll expand the Supreme Court to 11. But he's not going to say that, no matter, and he'll get beaten up by Donald Trump for not answering the question. But he's not going to say that he's going to expand the court. And then I think the choice, it's interesting again, but this is politics, and these are the narratives people focus in on, is the idea, and we can go back to one of the slides Sam presented where it showed so few people, that so little traction on this issue of Joe Biden being too progressive, is, I characterize Kamala Harris as a very safe pick. She didn't win and didn't get any traction during the primary season, partly because she wasn't progressive enough. She was an outlier on the conservative side. She wasn't moderate like a Biden or some of the others in the race, and she wasn't certainly a liberal like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. So she sort of sat there and got lost in the shuffle because she really couldn't find a place for herself. So I think she was a very safe, moderate pick for Joe Biden. So yeah, I agree with Matthew on all of that. I think the decisions are, I think this is, people took a decision based on who the candidate was in this instance.
And I have permission from Matthew to put him on the spot and say, Matthew, who's going to win? Where should we place our bets if we were going to bet?
Well, I'm certainly not ruling out Trump's chance of winning, but I believe the betting markets are just totally divorced from reality here. They give Trump way too much chance. And therefore, from a betting point of view, all the values with backing Biden just to win outright is a great bet. That's not for everyone. You're not going to get rich at 4 to 7 or whatever his price is. So, I have been betting Biden to actually win quite easily. I think that's underrated by the markets. So you can get about 6 to 1, 7 to 1, I think, on Biden to win over 400 electoral college votes, which sounds a lot. But he's ahead in most of the states that would get him close to that. And Texas is probably the only one that seems a little bit of a reach. He's not far behind there, and he's only 2 or 3 to 1 to win Texas. So if I were recommending a bet on this election, I'd be looking at something like that. Biden to win easily, over 400.
It is worth saying that Matthew and I did an event very similar to this one in 2015 ahead of the gen election, and Matthew was spot on then. So I don't want to tell anybody what to do with their money, but he did call it correctly. Thank you very much to our panelists for an absolutely fascinating discussion. I could stay on this call for another 2 hours just going through the details of the polls and where things are going. But Larry has to eat lunch, so we can't do that. All that remains for me to say is thank you very much to Sam, to Matthew, to Larry for joining us for this fascinating discussion. Thank you to everybody for joining us at home. If you would like to find out more and kind of get more insight into what's going on in the election, our sister website, CapEx, will be covering it nonstop over the next 2 weeks and also looking at the fallout. So go to capex.co to sign up for its newsletter and to read some of the great articles. Please follow us along on Twitter if you don't already. We are at CPS Think Tank. We look forward to seeing you at another one of these events very soon. And thank you once more to our panelists.
Thanks very much, Emily.
Take care.